Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Gbenga Aborowa. This is a show where we bring you the latest development in terms of security across the continent of Africa. Before we delve into today's show, let's bring you the latest security headlines across Africa. Libyan Prime Minister Gbenga escapes assassination attempt as battle for the country's control intensifies. The United Nations Security Council has expressed concern over Burkina Faso unconstitutional change of government and fails to label it a coup. And debates on Israel's observer status in the African Union have been put on hold as many member states kick. And at least 6 dead, several others wounded in a suicide attack in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. Today on Secure the Continent, we will be looking at security implications of France's withdrawal from Africa. Recall that France launched 5 major interventions in Africa over the last decade in Libya, the Ivory Coast, Mali, and the Central African Republic, as well as an extensive counterterrorism operation codenamed Worsen that encompassed several countries in the Sahel region. After nearly a decade, France's withdrawal signals changing tides. We have more for you in this report.
What began as Operation Server in 2013 to retake the troubled northern half of Mali from Islamist militants soon rose to become a 5,000-strong French intervention known as Operation Barkhane. Operation Barkhane officially started in 2014 and was set up by the French government to help Sahel countries overcome their terrorism challenges. France was stronger and had a better reach. Operation Barkhane has targeted Islamists and jihadists in the G5 Sahel countries, including Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger. With several successes recorded, it has also helped protect the region for more than 7 years. However, sentiment around the presence of French troops in these countries is swiftly changing, as the concept of Francafrique is also receiving widespread criticism, especially from Africans. French President Emmanuel Macron announced in July 2021 that the French government would bring an end to Operation Barkhane in the first quarter of 2022 in an orderly fashion. It is unknown what impact the withdrawal of the French forces will have on the countries where they have collaborated to fight insurgency and terrorism. But there are fears over eventualities. In other quarters, many believe it's high time the French left, as the military is yet another agent of French imperialism. Will a French pull out worsen security in Africa? Are African countries capable of standing on their own to fight insurgents and terrorists?
Now, join us live today to discuss this issue are Leonard Mbulle-Nziege. He joins in from Cape Town, South Africa. He's a research analyst at Africa Risk Consultant and ARC Briefing. He joins in from Cape Town, South Africa. And I also have joining in live from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Michael Shukrin, as the Director of Global Programs at 14 Knot Strategies. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you and welcome to Secure the Continent.
Thank you, Gbenga.
Now I'd like to start with Leonard. Leonard, could you please give us background and insight into France-Africa relations and how it has evolved over the years?
Thank you for having me on your show. France-Africa relations are very, very robust. In fact, France has done a very, very remarkable job of ensuring that they've had a very, very strong relations with their former colonies ever since they granted independence to them from the late 1950s. And these relations have been multidimensional in the security, economic, financial, and cultural domain. But then the security relations that they've had with these former colonies has been the most robust And in a unique move, which no other colonial power in Africa did, after they granted independence to their former colonies, France signed security accords. They call them the Accord de Défense, whereby France was going to act as the security guarantor of these newly independent countries, and in return, these countries would give France access to their precious minerals, and France would be able to have access to military bases. Well, France would be able to establish military bases in these countries. And over the years, France has been able to use that as a way to really establish firm relations, because their allies have been beneficiaries of French military interventions, as we've seen most recently in Mali, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, et cetera, et cetera. And that is as a result of France's deep-seated relations. And even though this has been going on for the past 60 years plus, there's increasing criticism because it's looked at as a very neo-colonialist arrangement, whereby France is able to send in their soldiers, they're able to have military bases, and it doesn't give African leaders as much agency, or in many instances, France uses those agreements not only to prop up their own, their personal interests, but also the interests of corrupt leaders who, in many instances, lack popularity at home, but know that they can bank on the support of France when they are in trouble domestically.
Thank you, Leonard, for that introduction. I'd like to bring in Dr. Shukran here. 9 years ago, French troops from the Serval mission, which was the precursor of the Barkhane, were hailed as liberators after they succeeded in driving out supporters of the movement for the openness and jihad in West Africa, Mujal, and Ansar-Din Islamist and militant extremists in northern Mali. I recall taxi drivers decorating their cars with French flags. Everyone hailed France as liberators, but there's a growing anti-French sentiment as we speak. What has changed?
First of all, thank you for having me on your show. Secondly, the report that you read earlier was, I think, fundamentally incorrect by saying that France was withdrawing from Africa. France is by no means withdrawing. France might be withdrawing from Mali, although no announcement has been made yet. And even if France were to withdraw from Mali, there would be French forces present in the area. There are several thousand in the area doing all sorts of things and under all sorts of names, operations, etc. So France isn't going anywhere. Plus, we see growing interest. Apparently, the French are getting more involved in Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, Togo, basically what we call the littoral states, all those countries that are on the Gulf of Guinea, trying to help them prepare themselves for sort of the coming onslaught of jihadist movements. So back to the question that you asked about what's changed, I think a lot has changed in terms of the misperceptions. I think there have been misperceptions about the French role. I think that people in the Sahel had this understanding that the French were going to sort of solve their problems for them. And yet, one thing that the report that you aired was right about was that the French only came in order to help the Sahelian countries. In other words, the Sahelian countries had to help themselves, and the French were going to help them do it. But the most of the work was really on their shoulders. And I think that because the Sahelian public didn't really understand this, and I think a lot of people assumed that sort of the mighty French army would take care of this problem, and then to discover that the mighty French army couldn't take care of the problem, they were, I think there's a lot of disappointment and then a lot of suspicion about what the French have been up to, not realizing that the French never could, how to put this, the French were never sufficient. They were necessary. So the French acting alone could not possibly defeat these Islamist insurgencies. They could simply help the Sahelian countries defeat the Islamist insurgencies. But a lot depends on whether or not those Sahelian countries actually go and do that. But in general, for your average Sahelian, I think there's just incomprehension, and they're looking around and they're wondering, why is it that everything's gotten worse in their countries? Insecurity is much worse. The French don't seem to have made a difference. And so what's going on? And I think that that's basically that fundamental dissonance, that fundamental problem is what's been driving a lot of the French anti-sentiment.
Now, I'd like to stay with you, Dr. Shukran. France deployed troops to Mali 9 years ago to fight a jihadist insurgency, yes, and has spent around 880 million euros a year on a mission that has cost about 55 French soldiers their lives, and it has failed to stop the insurgency and insecurity in the Sahel. Would you say France has failed in its mission militarily?
No, France has not failed in its mission. France could never. You have to understand that even 800 million euros a year and 5,000 soldiers is hardly sufficient for stopping the kind of problem that you have in the Sahel. First of all, you've got the geographic area. I mean, northern Mali itself is the size of France. And the Sahel itself, and the area that's in the operating area of Barkhane itself, is vast. And the distance between Nouakchott and Abéché in Chad, all of which falls under Barkhane's AOR. That's the size of the continental United States. So 5,000 soldiers, half a dozen aircraft, they can't do much. All they can do is help the local countries and ideally help them with things like governance and development. And a lot of people have criticized the French for being overly focused on security and not sufficiently focused on governance and basically all of the myriad problems that exist in these countries that are generating and fueling these insurgencies. These are not things that the French can solve. They can simply help the Saharan countries solve. And so I don't think the French have failed, at least the French military. I really frankly think it's the countries of the Sahel that have. And if the French are to blame, it's for perhaps not adequately communicating this to their partners and to their own civilian leaders, saying, look, what we're doing here might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. So I don't really see this as a French military failure. You could see it as a policy failure in the sense that they did this intervention that people didn't really understand, and perhaps they themselves didn't really think through in terms of the need to foster the development and the governance and all those many things that they have to do in order to take the wind from the sails of the insurgency. Instead, they focus on the military thing. So it's a very complex situation. These insurgencies are being generated by all sorts of internal conflicts between different communities and a lot of people who bear all sorts of resentments against the Malian government and the Burkinabe government and the Nigerian government. And you have all sorts of communities that are fighting one another. And there's not really much that the French can do about that other than to kind of create space in which these governments can try to address them. And I think they need to be asking whether or not they've been addressing them adequately.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shukin. I'd like to bring in Leonard here. Leonard, the task of the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, popularly known as MINUSMA, the biggest peacekeeping mission in the country with 13,000 troops, is to implement a 2015 peace agreement to stabilize the north. However, it has come under intense fire in the past for not intervening when conflict emerges in other parts of the country. What then is the purpose of the mission?
Thank you very much. And Dr. Shurkin really outlined things in a very clear manner. France has been criticized for putting a lot of focus on taking a military approach to the situation at hand, not only in Mali, but across the Sahel. Meanwhile, it's a multifaceted problem, which it's the multifaceted issues at hand, which have evolved over time. They're issues which have been in existence since the 60s. So yeah, I'd like to agree with him in that sense. And just with respect to the involvement of the UN, as you know, the UN is supposed to be, when they send in peacekeepers, they're supposed to act as a stabilizing force. And the stabilizing force is working in tandem with the governments. And the hope is that the governments would be able to take the necessary steps to root out the underlying issues which cause the conflict at hand. As we saw with the coup, one of the reasons in the coup in Mali, as well as in Burkina Faso, but then obviously it's a different case. The reason why these military governments overthrew the leaders is because they realized that not only were the presidents, but also the governments that they appointed were unable to address the issues at hand, and that was leading to an increase in the casualties as well as the deterioration of the security situation. So, in as much as we look to the UN as a force to be able to remedy the situation at hand, the bulk of the addressing the situation falls on the government, and we've seen that they've done, for the most part, miserably with respect to carrying out these responsibilities. And that's where we see France coming into play. And it's also one of the reasons why they have been able to continuously apply these accord de défense, that is the defense agreements, because they are aware that the governments in place, they are inherently weak. Some of them coming with very weak or shaky electoral mandates. And the fact that they don't have a popular mandate means that in many instances, they are understanding that they're going to have to rely on an external body or an external power such as France to bail them out. And as Dr. Shukran said, France has been doing that for decades upon decades for their allies. And the leaders in the Sahel were their allies. You had late Boubacar Keita. He studied in France. He was very close to the socialist leaders in France. In Burkina Faso, President Kabore, it was the same. Niger, former President Youssoufou Mahamadou, they had very, very strong ties with France. And they were of the understanding that even in the event that their national governments and their national armies and even the UN weren't able to really address the security situations at hand, they would be able to have France as a fallback. But then France has significantly misjudged. And I think they've badly approached the situation because, as Doctor said, they relied significantly on the military approach rather than looking at it in the broad-based sense, because the issues pertaining to governance, the issues pertaining to intercommunal violence, because it's not just the jihadists who are fighting each other, there are also intercommunal conflicts. At the level of economic development, there are very strong issues pertaining to lack of jobs for the youth, and that has led a lot of them to join the extremist group. So looking at the UN on one hand and their inability is just a single dimension of a very multidimensional problem that we see in the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Leonard. I'd like to bring back Dr. Shukran. Why? So, I mean, looking at the situation in Mali and the Sahel right now, there's still a lot of insecurity there. So, why is France drawing down troop numbers in its operations in Mali?
Well, first of all, one thing I want to address, this business about France propping up African leaders. I mean, certainly there's a lot of evidence. This certainly happened in the past, and there's a lot of truth to that. But at the same time, ATT was overthrown in a coup and the French did nothing. Ibeka was overthrown in a coup, France did nothing. There has been now 2 coups in Mali and France did nothing. So France isn't really propping up anybody, or at least not anybody that they necessarily even like or want. But because they don't really think that, again, we're not talking about this 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We're talking about the last 10 years, 15 years, that the French don't think it was really in their interest to be deciding who rules. They basically have worked with whatever. And then at the same time, I think a lot of people, part of the odd thing about this complaint that the French haven't paid enough attention to governance is that for the French to pay more attention to governance and to resolving all these conflicts, that would put France in frankly, a neo-colonial role of actually governing or arbitrating disputes amongst people in Mali and Burkina Faso. I think it's even stranger, right? Because that would be very neo-colonial to actually get involved in that stuff. So I see the French as sort of not wanting to get involved, and thus they've been, if anything else, they've been kind of turning a blind eye to these problems that these governments have been having. So they've been exercising, the governments have been exercising a lot of agency. And maybe the problem is that because of the French, they might have thought that the French would back them up. So maybe ATT or Roche Cabaret or Ibeka, maybe they thought that, okay, well, France will have my back, so I don't really have to worry. And then turns out that France didn't really have their back. There was a coup and the French didn't do anything because the French don't think it's their place to do anything. It's their place to help, to do what they can. And then they've been fighting. Now, again, unfortunately, this fighting is not, it hasn't had the effect that they wanted. And in terms of the drawdown, I think that this potential drawdown on Mali reflects the fact that French approach to Mali depends on cooperating with the Malian government and having a partnership with the Malian government. And otherwise, it's not going to work. So if the Malian government doesn't want to cooperate, then there's no point in the French being there, or there's very little point. And so I think if the French do pull out of Mali, I think that's what you're seeing, just a sort of sense that, well, we came here to work with the Malians, and if they don't want to work with us, then what we're going to do isn't going to achieve much. So, okay, so we'll go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Shurkin. There's definitely growing anti-French sentiments in the Sahel, especially in countries that have recently witnessed coups. We saw demonstrations come out in large numbers when the French ambassador to Mali was expelled. Let's take a listen to the Malian Prime Minister, Chogo Kokala Maiga, and what he has to say about French and Malian relationships.
Hollande l'a dit ici, qui payait une dette en 2013. Pourquoi on passe le temps à nous dire les soldats français sont morts? Les Américains n'ont-ils pas libéré la France? L'armée rouge n'a pas libéré une partie de l'Europe? Pourtant, quand les Français ont décidé que ce n'est plus nécessaire, ils ont dit aux Américains de partir. Est-ce que les Américains se sont mis à insulter les Français?
Now, Leonard, I would like to take your reaction to what the Malian interim prime minister said. He criticized the French military agreement. He's called it unbalanced and noting that Mali cannot even fly over its territory without France's permission, and they're seeking a review of what he termed unbalanced defense deal. What might the type of review be? What are your thoughts?
France has a very, very special post-colonial relationship on the continent, which no other former colonial power has. And the reason is because France understands that its position as a global power has been largely derived because of its heavy involvement in Francophone Africa. And a major reason behind this is the security, it's the security agreement. As I said, you had the Accord de Défense, which allows France to intervene at the request of African countries when they're in trouble. Sometimes they did it without their request, but then also the ability to implant military bases across these countries. And a lot of these agreements are very, very uneven. As the Prime Minister noted, France is not they can only get authorization from France in certain instances. And in many instances, these countries try to carry out operations, military operations, but then France says they're not allowed to. I mean, even in Mali, for example, they wanted to the Malian government wanted to negotiate with the violent extremist groups, and then France has been opposed to it. And those are just one of the many issues that you're having increasingly about the uneven nature of France's involvement, because what we've seen in the past is that France will, and is with any global power would do, they would intervene where they see that the interests are best served. And we talked about the involvement of Ibeka in the overthrow of former President Keita in Mali and the former President Kabore. One of the reasons why, in both instances, the reasons why France didn't intervene was because they understood that even though these are leaders that they supported, there was so much popular discord, or there were so many grievances against them, that it would be it wouldn't be good.
It would be against the
for
tide.
the image of France, yes, to intervene. So what we're seeing is that people are angry with the way, not only the African leadership, as you see with Prime Minister Maiga in Mali, but even amongst the African youth in the Sahel and just across Francophone Africa, because France has had this paternalistic, neocolonial way of operating on the continent, not just in the military sense, but also politically. They've been intervening, and they still intervene to date. They support leaders and across the continent, like President Ouattara, who went in for a third term and did a constitutional coup. Economically, you start the existence of the CFA franc, which is essentially controlled by the French Treasury and Banque de France. And what you're seeing now is that, you know, with globalization and the emergence of new global powers, or powers who are trying to assert their influence on the continent, like China, Russia, and so on and so forth, Africans and their African populations and leaders want to have different options, because they see that France is not necessarily apt to be able to solve the deep-seated problems that they have. Although I understand that, we also have to understand that the African governments have more agency than sometimes we tend to believe in order to address these problems. But then, obviously, you know, deep-seated issues like terrorism, you also need international support. And from what we see now, we see the anti-French sentiment arises from the fact that after all these years, France really isn't cutting, they're not
Okay.
really doing the job that these leaders expect.
Thank you very
And the
much,
population.
Leonard. This is a fine place to go on a break. When we come back, we'll be looking at Mali's shopping for new friends and the Russian group mercenary, the Russian Wagner mercenary group, and we'll also be looking at solutions to problems in the Sahel. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back on Continent. You're watching Secure the Continent. You're welcome back. We're still discussing solutions to the problems in the Sahel and the security implications if France decides to leave Mali. What would it be? I have with me Leonard Mbulle-Nziege and Dr. Michael Shirkin. I would like to come to Dr. Shirkin. I mean, Mali is not really happy. We heard the Prime Minister there with France. The relationship is it's not at the best of times. Now, they're shopping for new friends, and we've seen the presence of the Russian mercenary group, the Wagner group, and there. So what are the strategic risks of non-state actors working in such a volatile region? Do you think the Malian juntas really thought this through? And are the Russians just opportunists?
Sure. So there's a lot going on. First of all, we need to remember that Mali's prime minister was not elected. He's not a prime minister in the normal sense. He was a fairly minor politician who was nominated for this post by a handful of army officers who overthrew the constitutionally elected president. And they appointed Maiga because that put a civilian face onto the junta and because of his association with the democratic opposition. So it looked good for them. He's what I think they sometimes refer to as a beard for the military junta. And Maiga has found it useful to use anti-French rhetoric to basically to cater to the street,
Support.
as they say. So it's a form of populism, and it's also a great way to distract people from the problems of the government and the problems of the junta. And the fact that the insurgency is being generated by a very complex array of very difficult problems, none of which they're addressing. So rather than deal with all of these problems, let's go sort of pick a fight with France, which sells very well. Mm-hmm. And that in a nutshell is what they're doing. Now, the problem with the Russians are multifold. First of all, the Wagner group is known to commit human rights abuses. They've been committing all sorts of atrocities in the Central African Republic. In particular, they're known for murdering Fulanis. And this is part of the problem because part of the problem in Central Mali, and one of the things that's generating the insurgency in Central Mali are very bad relationships between certain parts of the Fulani community and the Malian state, and between certain parts of the Fulani community and other parts of the community, other neighbors. So attacking Fulanis or bringing Wagner in, that's probably just they're gonna murder Fulanis. That just makes everything worse. And at the same time, it also speaks to the Malian government's lack of concern for the sorts of intercommunal and interethnic conflicts that are generating the insurgency. So rather than trying to fix the conflicts, trying to arbitrate amongst these warring communities, they're just kind of throwing gasoline onto the fire. It's a real problem. The other thing is that it's been very clear that a lot of Malians seem to think that Russians have this magnetic or magical ability to do what the French have not been able to achieve. Almost as if a few hundred Russians can do what 5,000 French cannot. That's just sort of on the face of it absurd. And then more frighteningly, I often hear Malians say things like, well, because the Russians would take the gloves off. Well, what does that mean? Meaning what? They're going to kill civilians? Is that the answer? So it's a very dangerous thing. We've also seen that the friendship with Russia seems to be, it's encouraged some Malians to take on this gambit where they're antagonizing France, they're antagonizing the European Union, they're antagonizing the Germans, and they're antagonizing ECOWAS, the regional group. And they feel like they can get away with this because they've got this new best friend. But this new best friend, like, what have they done for them? The new best friend is simply given them, you've got a few hundred mercenaries. That's not the same thing at all. So meanwhile, what they're doing is they're burning bridges with the French. And the French, by the way, are still in the field fighting alongside Malian forces, training Malian forces. And if they go away, that means that the Malian forces are not going to have that kind of support. They're not going to have air support. They call in French air support all the time. They get into a fight, they need some Mirage, a Rafale to come and drop some bombs to deal with the problem. The French have been doing this. So if the French leave, again, a few hundred Russians aren't going to be able to provide the same kind of assistance as the French. So there's this danger. So the role of the Russians is simply to encourage some Malians in the belief that they can do without the French, but they can't. And the Russians are not going to help. And it's just a shortcut that's going to help the Malian government avoid the responsibility for dealing with all the myriad social problems and all the interethnic conflicts and all these sorts of things. So it's like a silver bullet that'll magically make the problem go away. Okay. Meanwhile, the Russians are delighted to create chaos and disorder and to stick their fingers in the eyes of France, but then to also create problems. And maybe if this means that they can get access to lithium and cobalt and gold, so much the better. Although it's not clear if that's the prime motive, it's really hard to tell.
Now, before I come to Leonard,
this is not a good development for Mali or the region.
Thanks, Doctor. Before I come to Leonard, I'd like us to have a listen to what the Chief of Staff of the French Armed Forces, General Thierry Bocard, had to say about the ongoing conflict.
Les massacres répétés que produisent les terroristes, massacrer des villageois, dans l'absolu, c'est pas gagner le cœur des populations. Et pour autant, par ce message-là, finalement, ils arrivent à affaiblir les gouvernements en place et finalement réduire et un peu, comme vous l'avez dit, en fait, développer le sentiment contre l'armée française. Ça veut dire que nous aussi, on doit être capable de communiquer, de montrer ce qu'on fait. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement important. Et l'armée française, comme l'armée ivoirienne, comme les armées africaines, on doit progresser dans ce domaine-là.
Now, Leonard, one of the reasons for France's strange relationship with Mali is the junta's alleged hiring. I mean, it's no longer alleged. There are visuals. We do know that the Russian mercenary group Wagner is present in Mali. And the French government ministers have called it unacceptable and incompatible with any continued French military presence. Mali is a sovereign state, and do they not have agency to decide who they want to do business with, regardless of the consequences?
Well, it's interesting because obviously there are a myriad of issues, and bringing in the Russians isn't going to solve all of them. But then I think what they look at is what's the most pressing for them at this point in time is addressing the security situation. And as I said, African governments have more agency nowadays than they realize. And you can see that the Malian leaders took example from Central African Republic, another country which has relied significantly on French military intervention to address its security challenges. And in 2017, President Akash Touadéra, sorry, I messed up the name there, but the Central African Republic president, he brought in the Russian Wagner Group mercenaries, and now they're working alongside the Rwandan army, and France has taken a back seat, and at present they're just in essence training the national police force. And it seems like it's working for the Central African Republic. It hasn't solved the myriad of their problems, but then compared to what was going on with the French situation, it seems like that's what the government is comfortable with. The Malian government was always aware that they would have to find another solution when they started to have this tug of war, as we say in French, bras de fer, with the French authorities. And Mali is a country which is unique in the Sahel because they've had long-standing relations with Russia, dating back to when it was the Soviet Union. You have to understand that Mali had a radical leader, Modibo Keita, who was a pro-Soviet leader, and they were receiving significant amounts of assistance from the Soviet Union as well as Czechoslovakia in the 60s. So this is, I think, some sort of reigniting of the relationship. You have to also understand Mali's defense minister, Suleiman Camara. He studied in Moscow, and the Malian military leaders, they aren't stupid. They knew what they were going to do, and they were already looking at the options. And I think for them, they were looking at the options which should enable them to be able to obtain the best results on the ground, but also with the least accountability, because they are a military junta, and it's difficult to hold them to account. So they knew what they were doing. However, I don't think that it's sustainable to look towards only the Russians at this point in time. And I think that it's not just Somali, but the other countries like Burkina Faso, for example, which has a bilateral defense agreement with Turkey, they're going to start looking towards other nations beyond Russia, because Russia, well, not Russia, but then the Wagner Group as a private entity, they can only do so much. And, the interpersonal relations with the community, they won't be able to foster those. But then, you have, for instance, maybe Turkey with their drones. The Israelis, they're very strong in terms of defense and intelligence, and they've fostered a lot of relations with Francophone West and Central African nations. They can build on that as well. China, UAE, yeah.
Thank you, Leonard. We're fast running out of time, but I'd like to bring Dr. Shirkin here. I saw him nodding in disagreement when you said that the Wagner Group has some type of positive result in the Central African Republic. Now, my question to you, Dr. Shirkin, is this. Is there some concern about, in the event that France leaves, you could throw billions of dollars to a war effort, you could train soldiers like the Afghan National Army, and they disperse. In the event that the French leave, do you think the local armies in the Sahel, for example, Mali, well equipped to deal with the security challenges? And I would like you to respond to Leonard's Wagner Group comment on Central African Republic.
Yeah, so, first of all, absolutely, it's Mali's sovereign right to decide whom to work with. That goes without saying. It's absolutely true. I think in this case, it's so incredibly short-sighted. The answer is basically you work with the French and you also invite the Russians to come and you can have Wagner in the same territory and everything's fine. But the way the Malian junta has made this is sort of it's an either or, because while they're inviting the Russians in, they're clearly antagonizing the French. And ultimately the French are more important and more useful and have already lost 50 soldiers and billions of dollars worth of euros. They have this investment and they saved the country. And so, I don't want to say it's a question of gratitude or anything, because that's presumptuous, but it's a very short-sighted thing to do, to antagonize your big friend in order to sort of flirt with this new sort of friend that really isn't offering you anything. It's sort of kind of crazy.
Dr. Shirkin, if you look at what Leonard said, they've established relations since the 60s. And
yes, this is absolutely true, which is why there have been Russian advisors and Russian equipment in Mali all along. And that hasn't really bothered anybody. There've been Russians there all along, and they've been doing training. They've been having contractors. They've got the helicopters. They fix the helicopters. There's also stuff the Russians have been doing, which is totally benign and absolutely okay, and nobody has any problems with it whatsoever. But then when you've got this regime that is very keen on not doing anything to address its own sort of problems, right? These myriad problems that I keep talking about, is looking for shortcuts, and thinks that it, has found that through sort of populist politics, it can create for itself, so it can foster, burn its own legitimacy. And the idea that they're going to bring in these mercenaries, as and it said, is about accountability. There's no accountability here with Wagner. So Wagner can do what they've been doing in Central African Republic, which is basically they're killing civilians. They're not making anything better. And the Central African Republic has been paying for it through tax farming, by handing over basic functions of the Central African state to Wagner. And most recently, I heard that Wagner's thinking about leaving because the government doesn't have any more money. It's not made Central African Republic a better place, and Wagner's not going to make Mali a better place. And if the first concern is security, this isn't going to help the security. If you could convince me that Wagner was going to help Mali solve its security problems, I'd be all in favor of it.
Okay, that leads me to this $1 million question. There's no way we can talk about this without preferring solutions, but we are seriously running out of time. So I know this is the $1 million question, and I'm going to come to Leonard too. In 30 seconds, what's the situation? I mean, what's the solution to long-term peace in the Sahel using Mali as an anchor point?
We can't only rely on the security approach. Even though the security issues are the most glaring, they're multidimensional problems, and the governments at hand need to actually take deep steps to actually address those issues pertaining to unemployment, intercommunal violence, poor governance, the absence of the state across lots of the territories of the country, because that's what allows the extremists to take roots in those places. So too much focus on the security aspect should be thrown away.
Now, Dr. Shurkin, final answer, final thoughts.
I completely agree. Everything he said is absolutely true and correct, and yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join me on Secure the Continent today. I did enjoy your insights on the subject.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Africa must avoid being a center of a global war for the control of resources and battle for influence. Countries having a French military presence in Africa should build a strong army of young, energetic, well-remunerated and treated soldiers. French military intelligence may be necessary, the baby and the bathwater shouldn't be poured away. Many thanks for watching. See you next time on Secure the Continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.